So, what if your burnout isn't actually, a personal failure? What if it's just a completely logical reaction to the environment you live in?
Right, like the water we're swimming in.
Exactly. Today, we are looking at this really radical proposition, which is that capitalism isn't just an economic system, but it's actually a psychological condition.
Yeah, it's a profound shift in perspective, really.
It is, because across the globe right now, I mean, rates of anxiety, depression, loneliness, exhaustion, they are just skyrocketing.
Mm.
And it is incredibly easy to internalize those feelings.
Right. Oh, absolutely.
You just assume, well, I'm not resilient enough, or
Yeah.
I'm failing to manage my stress properly. But zooming out changes that entire picture. What is all these separate feelings of isolation and anxiety are actually symptoms of a shared underlying framework?
Right. And we have this really strong tendency in modern medicine to pathologize the individual.
Yeah.
Like, we focus so intensely on the person sitting in the clinic, and we rarely zoom out to ask if the environment itself is the thing making them sick.
And, well, zooming out to examine that environment is the whole mission of today's deep dive. We're looking at a fascinating piece from Psychology Today by clinical psychologist Dr. Vinita Mehta.
Yeah, it's a great piece.
It really is. She's unpacking this highly provocative paper by Karim Bettache from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. And Bettache is asking this massive question. Is capitalism actively giving rise to the psychological ills of our day?
Which is such a huge thing to tackle.
Right. His core argument is that capitalism isn't simply, organizing our logistics and markets.
Mm.
It is actively shaping our neurobiology, our deeply held beliefs, and our behaviors.
Yeah, Betesh is basically taking macroeconomic principles, like the stuff you usually only study in an economics class, and he's running them through a clinical psychological lens.
Right.
He wants to map out the exact psychological mechanics of how an economic structure actually infiltrates the human mind.
It's wild to think about. Now, before we get into the actual mechanisms he outlines, I do want to take a quick second and address you, the listener, directly. Because we are exploring a political and economic critique of capitalism today, we want to be crystal clear about our role here.
Yeah, this is really important.
Right. Both of us are remaining strictly neutral. We are not taking sides, and we are not endorsing the viewpoints of the original source material. Our job is simply to act as your impartial guides.
Exactly.
We're just here to convey and analyze the ideas presented by Dr. Bettache and Dr. Mehta and help you understand this really intricate theory they're putting forward.
We are looking strictly at the how and the why of his argument, examining the psychological modeling Bettach proposes, completely independent of any political ideology.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand how a global financial system actually rewires the human mind, we first have to look at how we establish our own sense of self-worth. In a purely market-driven system, the overarching drive is for, well, continuous capital accumulation. Growth is the only acceptable metric.
Yeah, and Bettach argues that this relentless drive doesn't just stay contained within the stock market, it leaks into our cognition.
What he calls gain primacy syndrome, right?
Yes, exactly. Game primacy syndrome. We start viewing our own lives through the language of the market, and the vocabulary we use is a really powerful indicator of how we process reality.
Right, like the words we choose actually shape our thoughts.
Exactly. Bettach notes that education is now almost exclusively framed as an investment in human capital.
Oh, yeah, human capital.
Right. Career success becomes the ultimate measure of a person's utility. We basically stop being human beings experiencing a life, and we become assets that must continually appreciate and value.
I mean, it is genuinely dystopian when you stop and listen to modern conversation. People will casually talk about needing to protect their personal brand.
Well, their personal brand, yeah.
Right. Or they'll complain that they aren't getting a good ROI, a return on investment, on a friendship.
Yeah, that's... Are we treating our own lives like a corporate spreadsheet? When you use ROI to describe personal relationships, you are fundamentally changing the nature of love and friendship.
What's fascinating here is how this vocabulary shifts the fundamental nature of human interaction. When you calculate the ROI of a relationship, you're moving that connection away from having intrinsic value.
Just being valuable for its own sake.
Exactly. The idea that a friendship is valuable simply because human connection is biologically and emotionally necessary, you're moving it away from that to merely having transactional value.
It has to yield a profit, it has to advance your standing in some way, or it's a waste of time.
Right. And the clinical implication of that shift is just devastating. When your self-perception is tied to being an appreciating asset, your baseline psychological state basically becomes one of inadequacy.
Because you could always be doing more.
Precisely. If you aren't actively growing your net worth or optimizing your health metrics or expanding your network, you aren't just stagnant, you are failing.
It triggers this chronic, low-grade stress response because the market demands infinite growth, which is, a biological impossibility for a human being.
We just physically can't do it.
Yeah.
But wait, if I am constantly optimizing myself as a brand, what happens when I step out my front door and interact with another optimized brand?
Right, the other people out there.
Yeah. Does a market mindset allow for genuine connection, or does it automatically turn the person across from me into the competition?
And that collision is exactly what Bettache explores next with his second concept, zero-sum rivalry syndrome.
Zero-sum rivalry syndrome.
Yeah. If everyone is an enterprise seeking to maximize returns, the people around you cease to be a community. They basically become rivals competing for market share.
So it's me versus you.
Exactly. This breeds a deep, pervasive zero-sum thinking.
Let's be real for a second, though. Competition isn't inherently evil.
No, of course not.
I mean, it is the engine behind almost all major human innovation. It pushes people to invent things, to cure diseases, to strive for excellence. So if we pathologize the competitive drive, don't we kind of kill the ambition that solves big global problems?
That's a great point. But the distinction Bettache draws isn't about eliminating market competition entirely. The danger lies in the spillover effect.
Okay, the spillover effect. What does that look like?
So using competition to drive a corporate sector might yield innovation, sure, but applying that exact same competitive framework to your daily social life is highly destructive.
Oh, I see.
It's the psychological equivalent of a closed thermodynamic system. You start believing that joy, success, or security are finite resources.
Like a pie, and if someone takes a slice, there's less for me.
Exactly. If your neighbor acquires a promotion or a new level of social status, you subconsciously process it as them drain that resource from your atmosphere.
So it's not that competition at work is bad. It's that bringing the rules of the boardroom to your neighborhood barbecue destroys your ability to connect.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
It sounds so exhausting. And I imagine it actively erodes empathy because you can't really deeply connect with someone you are subconsciously trying to defeat.
You really can't. And empathy is biologically expensive. It requires vulnerability and trust. In a cooperative environment, empathy is a survival mechanism. It binds the group together.
Right.
But in an environment governed by zero-sum rivalry, empathy becomes a strategic liability. The research cited in the article highlights this so clearly. Highly competitive social environments consistently increase negative affect, decrease interpersonal trust, and actively sever the social bonds required for mental stability.
So if our interpersonal lives are reduced to this bitter, zero-sum competition, how do we prove to our rivals that we're actually winning?
Oh, you have to show them, right?
You have to buy the proof.
Which brings us to the third concept, the physical manifestation of this mindset, which is the relentless pursuit of private ownership, or ownership syndrome.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because the core tenet of capitalism relies on private ownership being the ultimate signal of personal freedom.
Right, the American dream, essentially.
Exactly. But Bettache points out that the pursuit of that ownership just morphs into materialism.
Yeah.
And the clinical data on materialism is staggering.
It really is.
It is directly linked to lower self-esteem, intense anxiety, severe depression, and higher rates of substance abuse.
We really need to look at the psychological mechanism driving that anxiety, too. It operates on the hedonic treadmill.
Oh, right, the dopamine hit.
Exactly. Purchasing a new item triggers a distinct spike in dopamine. You feel a rush of pleasure and validation, but dopamine is inherently fleeting.
It never lasts.
No, it doesn't. When it crashes, the void returns, often larger than before, requiring a more expensive or exclusive purchase to achieve the same biochemical high.
And the article gives excellent examples of how industries completely exploit this. Like the car industry isn't selling you a machine to move you from point A to point B.
Not at all.
A luxury vehicle is engineered to signal your status to your rivals. High fashion does the exact same thing by communicating exclusivity. It basically tells the world you belong to an elite social tribe.
Yeah.
I always think of luxury items as a kind of wearable resume. You are buying an identity off a rack because you don't have the time or the internal peace to actually develop one.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals a profound paradox. The system promotes private ownership under the explicit promise of personal freedom and liberation.
Right, buy this and you'll be free.
The narrative dictates that the more you own, the freer you are, yet the psychological reality operates in the exact opposite direction.
Because it shifts your locus of control completely outside of yourself. Your worth is entirely dependent on things you can lose.
And you become trapped in an endless cycle to maintain that worth.
Yeah.
You buy the luxury car to signal your status, but then a newer model is released where your neighbor buys a more expensive vehicle, triggering your zero-sum rivalry all over again.
Oh man, yeah.
So you are forced to work harder, treating yourself as human capital, to afford the upgrade, thus triggering the endless loop of optimization. It's an interconnected web that severely compromises mental health while masquerading as personal liberty.
It is a trap. So, okay, we have a pretty clear picture of the diagnosis now.
Right.
We treat ourselves as human capital and brands. We view our peers through zero-sum lens, which destroys our empathy. And we try to medicate the resulting anxiety with a materialism that only traps us further.
That's the triad, yeah.
If a global macroeconomic system is causing this psychological distress, what is the prescription? How do you treat a patient whose illness is literally the economy?
Well, Bettache suggests that the only viable treatment for a systemic disease is a collective structural response. You cannot meditate your way out of a macroeconomic crisis.
No amount of mindfulness apps will fix it.
Exactly. He outlines pathways to mitigate these effects by deliberately shifting environments from individualistic competition back to cooperation.
So what does this all mean in practice? Like, how does that actually work?
Yeah.
Let's look at the education system. Right now, schooling is highly competitive.
Very much so.
It's all about ranking, dominating the grading curve, beating the other students to secure a spot at a top university. Bettache suggests a radical shift toward cooperative learning models instead.
And the clinical mechanics of cooperative learning are fascinating. When you remove the competitive grading curve, you remove the environmental threat.
The threat of losing.
Right. In a hyper-competitive classroom, a student's nervous system is just flooded with cortisol because another student's success is a direct threat to their own ranking.
It's that zero-sum rivalry again.
Exactly. Cooperative learning removes that zero-sum dynamic.
So without all that cortisol, their brains can actually function better. I mean, the article notes that cooperative learning promotes deep social bonds without compromising academic performance at all.
Not at all. It actively rewires the brain away from viewing peers as threats, allowing the prefrontal cortex to engage in complex problem solving rather than just, basic survival mechanics.
That makes total sense.
And Bettache applies this exact same logic to the workplace. Instead of relying on the intense pressure of individual performance reviews, he points to the structural benefits of employee ownership models and worker cooperatives.
Right, because in a worker cooperative, the incentives are fundamentally aligned. If the company succeeds, everyone profits. You eliminate the internal zero-sum battle because a win for your colleague actually translates to a win for you.
Yes.
It systematically removes the daily friction of trying to outmaneuver the person at the desk right next to you.
You are structurally mandated to support your peers. But perhaps the most radical paradigm shift Bettache proposes is within the practice of clinical psychology itself.
Okay, yeah.
He argues for a fundamental change in how therapists interact with their clients.
He suggests clinicians need to help clients distinguish between purely personal, individual pathologies and issues that actually require a collective response. And the concept that absolutely stopped me in my tracks was this idea of a proportionate response.
Yes, the proportionate response.
That a person's crushing burnout might actually be a completely healthy, proportionate response to an economic system that demands infinite growth from finite human bodies.
Yeah.
Is it actually possible for an individual sitting in a therapist's office to untangle what is a personal mental health struggle versus what is a proportionate response to the global economy?
This raises an important question about the modern function of therapy. Historically, when a client presents with anxiety or burnout, the therapeutic focus has been almost entirely on improving their individual coping mechanisms.
Like, how can you handle the stress better?
Right. The implicit underlying message is often, you are broken, you are failing to adapt. We need to fix your mindset so you can survive the demands of the world.
Wow. It's like the difference between believing you are a terrible swimmer who just keeps sinking versus having someone finally point out that you are actually trying to swim in a pool filled with wet cement.
That is a perfect analogy.
The context changes everything about how you view your struggle.
And that context lifts a tremendous burden of shame. When a clinician helps a client identify systemic factors, when they point out that the exhaustion is a direct result of commodifying themselves, it moves the struggle away from being an individual flaw.
It validates them.
It validates their experience completely. Realizing that your anxiety is a logical reaction to an exhausting system rather than a personal failure of resilience can be the actual catalyst for genuine healing.
That's powerful.
It empowers the individual to stop trying to fix themselves in ways that only serve the system and instead seek out collective solidarity.
Today, we've taken a real deep dive into the invisible forces shaping our minds. We explored how treating ourselves as appreciating assets alienates us from our intrinsic worth. We looked at how competitive spillover turns our communities into rivals, draining our empathy.
Yeah.
We unpacked this psychological trap of materialism, where the promise of freedom through ownership actually places us on an endless, anxiety-inducing treadmill. And finally, we explored the profound hope found in cooperative classrooms, aligned workplaces, and a new clinical approach that validates the real weight of the world we live in.
It really provides a vital framework for understanding the modern epidemic of mental distress, not as a collection of personal failings, but as a shared systemic symptom.
Absolutely. So as you move through your week, I challenge you to pay close attention to your own vocabulary. Notice the words you use without even thinking about it.
Yeah, that's a great exercise.
How often do you catch yourself talking about investing time in a hobby, as if joy requires a measurable return? How often do you think about managing your personal brand when you're just interacting with peers? Understanding the language these invisible forces use to sneak into our minds is your absolute best shortcut to being truly well-informed about your own mental well-being.
Naming the framework really is the first crucial step in dismantling its hold on your cognition.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. If the very language of the market is what shapes our distress and enforces this zero-sum thinking, could simply choosing different words to describe your daily life, your passions, and your relationships be the first quiet act of rebellion in reclaiming your mental health?
Wow.
If you refuse to call a friendship an investment and instead just call it a connection, what actually changes in your brain? Think about that. Because maybe the X-ray isn't broken. Maybe we've just been looking at the wrong part of the body entirely. We've been aggressively X-raying the individual when we should have been examining the environment all along.